All right, so my presentation is the effect of foreign substance on baseballs. So recently in the MLB, many pitchers have been using foreign substances or sticky stuff on the baseball to help their performance while they were pitching. And just recently, this past year, the MLB decided to actually enforce the rule of banning these foreign substances on the baseballs. So what I wanted to look at is, why did the players feel the need to use this sticky stuff, and what was the effect that it had on the baseball? And to answer this question, I analyzed the physics of a baseball in motion, and I also looked at data from the two MLB pitchers and also from data of myself throwing. So onto the physics. Even though the baseball is, when thrown, is just traveling through the air, there's more forces acting on it other than gravity. As you can see up there, the force of gravity is pointed down, and then there is a drag force in the opposite direction of the velocity vector, and then there is a Magnus force, which is a force caused by the air particles that stick to the baseball as it moves. And the direction of the Magnus force is in the direction of the cross product of the vectors of the angular velocity, or spin rate, and the linear velocity. So we have an equation that can model the Magnus force. Fm equals 1/2 CL PAV squared. P is the density of the air, that remains constant. A is the cross-sectional area of the baseball, that remains constant. And for the purposes of my study, I tried to keep the velocity constant too, and I wanted to focus on the lift coefficient, which scientists haven't gotten an exact value for, but I think it's primarily a function of the spin factor, which is the radius of the ball times the angular velocity over the linear velocity. So we can see through proportional relationships that if you can increase the spin on the baseball, then you can increase the Magnus force, and the pitcher can increase the movement in the desired direction of the pitch. And the reason that the foreign substances create more spin rate is because of friction. They create a higher coefficient of friction between the pitcher's hand and the ball, and because the baseball is rotating, we can apply the principles of torque. So net torque, as you can see up there, is the radius of the baseball, which is constant, times the force, and then it's also the rotational inertia times the angular acceleration. So if we can increase the friction force, we can increase the torque, and then if we increase the torque, because the rotational inertia will stay constant, we can increase the angular acceleration and therefore increase the angular velocity. So by using the sticky substances, a pitcher can increase their spin rate and therefore increase the movement on the baseball. And that was all kind of theoretical, so I wanted to look at actual pitchers to get data to see how this has applications in actual baseball. So what I did is I looked at something called StatCast data, and that's the thing in MLB ballparks. It gets data on everything that goes on, so the velocity and the spin of the ball as it leaves the pitcher's hand, and then also the exit velocity and the launch angle of the ball as the hitter hits it. So what I wanted to look at were both basic stats and advanced stats to judge the pitcher's performance versus the hitter. So basic stats like ERA, or earned run average, are stuff that can be easily calculated, and that is a pretty good metric of determining how well a pitcher is performing. But I like to use more is advanced stats, such as X over here, which it uses the data from the StatCast to just isolate what the hitter does versus the pitcher, and it takes out of the equation factors such as luck, defense, or what ballpark they're playing in. So I think that advanced stats are the best way to just isolate how a pitcher is performing against a hitter. So for the data, I wanted to do it on two MLB pitchers, Garrett Cole and Trevor Bauer, for their fastball, which kind of has backspin like this, curveball, which has more topspin like that, moves down, and a slider that has more side spin like that and moves down and to the side, depending on whether you're righty or lefty. So the first pitcher I looked at was Garrett Cole, and the StatCast, it was implemented in 2015. That's the first year they have the data. When Garrett Cole in 2015, his spin rate on his fastball was 2150 RPM, and towards recently in 2020 and 2021, he has gotten his spin rate up to about 2,500. And the difference with Garrett Cole is back in 2015, he was like a league average pitcher, nothing special, and now he's one of the best pitchers in the MLB. He's a perennial All-Star, and he's earned himself a $350 million contract. And as I looked at the stats, as his fastball increased in spin rate, he performed a lot better against hitters and was able to get a lot more hitters out and to produce weaker contact. And the same thing happened with the slider. He jumped about 650 RPM in the slider, and as he increased the spin rate on his slider was also more effective in getting hitters out and producing weaker contact. And what I saw with the curveball is he did increase his spin rate on his curveball a lot through the foreign substances, but his performance didn't go proportionally with that increase in spin rate. Some of his best seasons statistically with the curveball were when he had his lowest spin rate, and some of his worst statistical seasons was when he had a higher spin rate on his curveball. And so next pitcher I'm going to analyze is Trevor Bauer. He's kind of like the face of the whole spin rate scandal, if you will. And he pretty much went out and said, like, yeah, I'm going to use this stuff to help my performance until somebody makes me stop, which the MLB eventually did do, but it took them a while. But back in 2015, he had a fastball spin rate of 2,200, and he was like around a league average pitcher. He was nothing special. And then last year in 2020, he increased his spin rate with foreign substances to about 2,800 RPMs, and which was the highest in the MLB for fastball. And in that year, he won the National League Cy Young, which is awarded to the best pitcher in the National League. And his stats were absolutely off the charts. And then when you look at the slider, at the beginning of his career, he didn't even use his slider. He only threw it like 10 times per season in 2015 and 2016. And when he did throw it, it had a very low spin rate of just about 2,000 RPM. And as he was able to use the foreign substance and gain spin rate, he got a slider up to nearly 3,000 RPM, and that turned into his dominant wipeout pitch. And with his curveball, just like Garrett Cole, he was able to increase it about 600 RPM. But actually, as his spin rate increased on the curveball, his stats actually got worse, and he's moved more towards his slider as his dominant off-speed pitch instead of his curveball. And so just to wrap up the data here, I definitively found that with the fastball and the slider, as the spin rate increased on those pitches, the performance of those pitches was better, and they were better pitches. And on the curveball, I got mixed data, and there was no proportion between spin rate and the performance of the pitch. And then in addition to getting data from MLB players, I also got data of myself pitching with something called VapSoto, which uses high-speed slow-motion cameras to track stats such as pitch velocity and spin rate, and it also gets something called vertical and horizontal movement, and that's what I use to judge my performance since I was not able to do it against actual batters. And with a pitch, if it has more movement, it makes the baseball harder to hit. So that's kind of what I use to judge how good of a pitcher was. With my fastball and curveball, I use just vertical movement, and with my slider, I use both horizontal and vertical movements. And I also use rosin, which is a powder that is allowed in the MLB, and Spider Tack, which is a banned substance. And when I threw it with nothing on my hand just to get a baseline reading, my fastball was at about 2,100 RPM with a vertical break of positive 18 inches. My curveball was around 1,900 RPM with a vertical break of negative 20 inches, and my slider was around 2,050 RPMs with a vertical break of negative 10 inches and a horizontal break of negative 7.5 inches. And when I used the rosin, my stats were actually pretty similar to when I didn't use anything, and this is because I was in good conditions. I was indoors, and I had a good grip on the ball even with nothing on my hand. But when I find rosin useful is when I'm in an actual game and it's hot outside and my hands are all sweaty, and I feel like rosin allows me to be as good as I should be, and it doesn't give me any unfair advantage. And because of that, I like that it's allowed to be used. But then when I started to use the Spider Tack, like you can see the stuff is absurdly sticky. That's when like my stats started to really change. So the Spider Tack added about 300 RPMs to my fastball and 2 inches of vertical movement. It added about 600 RPM on my slider and 2 inches of vertical movement while keeping the same horizontal movement. And on my curveball, it added 650 RPM, but it actually had 2 less inches of vertical movement. So to compare my data with the data from the MLB players, both Garrett Cole, Trevor Bauer, and myself, as the spin rate on our fastballs increased, the pitches were definitively better. With the MLB players, they had better basic and advanced stats, and with my fastball, I had better vertical movement on that. And same thing goes with the slider. As Cole and Bauer were able to increase the spin rate on their slider, they were able to have more success with the pitch. And as I increased my spin rate, I was able to have more vertical movement while keeping the same horizontal movement. And then with the curveball is where my data kind of surprised me. I would have expected the curveball to be better like the fastball and the slider were, but the data just didn't show that. And I would like to do more research in the future as to why this is, but my guess would be maybe a curveball is a pitch that's more important about pitch location and trying to deceive the hitter rather than trying to get as much friction and as much spin as possible. And so, in conclusion, my research question was, what was the effect of foreign substance on baseballs? And besides for the data on the curveball, I got a pretty clear answer that the foreign substances had a big effect on pitchers and how they throw. Garrett Cole and Trevor Bauer, it turned them from 2 league average pitchers to 2 of the best pitchers in the MLB right now. And with my spin rate stats, it turned my spin rates from like an average high schooler to like stuff that you might see from like a high-level college player. It just completely transformed both the MLB pitchers and myself. And the reason I like this project so much is because as a baseball player, baseball's a game of physics, but I feel like most athletes don't really care to look into that side of the game because of, like sports and science, like it's kind of on 2 opposite ends of the spectrum. But doing this project and looking at the sport, I love baseball from a viewpoint of physics and mathematics, really gave me a whole new stance on how I can view pitching now. Thank you. And here are some of the sources I used.
Does anybody have questions they would like to ask Jared?
Yeah.
Yeah, Jared, if I understood you right at the end, you ascribed all the growth of the 2 pitchers to the use of spider tack. If it was banned this season, did you see a regression in their spin rate?
Yes, with Garrett Cole, his spin rate went down pretty significantly, and his stats showed he was like the front runner for Cy Young at the beginning of the year, and then towards the end of the year, his stats, both basic and advanced stats, they fell off, and he was a significantly worse pitcher. And then with Trevor Bauer, we didn't actually get to see him pitch without the foreign substance because he was suspended for off-the-field issues before the MLB enforced the crackdown. So it'll be interesting to see when he comes back how he will perform. Yeah.
So I guess I have a question about the curveball because you had trouble finding data that made sense. Were you able to? I'm not sure how you found this data, but did you think about the idea that because the fastball and the slider was so effective and so hard to hit, that hitters would just kind of try to sit on a curveball, and therefore the stats would not play out because of that?
I'm like, that's the thing with analyzing the spin rate. Like, pitching is a whole lot more than just spin rate. It's like mixing location, mixing timing, and like a bunch of other stuff like that. So I do think that definitely like the data I found with the curveball, I do think that could be a factor of maybe the pitchers like not being able to use the curveball as effectively in terms of like timing or location.
The other question I have is, did you look into at all just kind of physical strength based on like Garrett Cole and Bauer when they were younger pitchers versus when they became more dominant? Could you find any data?
I looked at stats of their velocity, which isn't affected by spin rate, and their velocity stayed fairly constant throughout their career, and their spin rate jumped. Which if your spin rate jumps and your velocity stays the same, that's like a indicator that someone is using foreign substances.
Yeah. Well, I knew they were using it.
Yeah.
For sure. Thank you.
Any other questions for Jared?
One other quick one. Right at the beginning, you talked about the Magnus force.
Uh-huh.
One of the components of that equation was density of air.
Mm-hmm.
Did you look at all about playing in Denver with less air at altitude, lower Magnus force, less movement on the ball?
I didn't look at that, but like I do know that when the air is like less dense, like the baseball like has more like carry on it. So I would actually have to do more research into that because that has air density proportional to the Magnus force. So you would think that the denser the air gets, the more lift it would have. But in reality, it appears as if like the less the less dense the air, the more it carries. So that's definitely something I would have to look into.
That's it for questions. Thank you, Jared.